Do expensive amplifiers sound better than cheap amplifiers? That's the question we're going to be exploring today. So save up your pennies and wait for the intro. Hey folks, I'm Gene Delasalo with Audioholics. Happy New Year, my friends. Today I want to talk to you about amplifiers. When you spend more money on amplifiers, do you get better sound? Do you get better performance? I'm going to tell you the answer right away. I'm not going to make you wait, and then we're going to go over the reasons why. So more money generally does get you better performance up into a certain price, because just like exotic cables, we have exotic amplifiers, and some of the stuff in those ultra expensive amplifiers gets a little ridiculous. But then again, the really cheap stuff, unlike cables, don't always give you the best performance. So let me tell you some factors that really determine the sound quality and the performance of an amplifier. Really, you have to look when you're comparing amplifier A to amplifier B, you have to see how they're rating power. A lot of the more inexpensive amplifiers on the market, they won't give you an all channels driven rating. They won't give you full bandwidth ratings. They generally give you power at 1 kilohertz at maybe 10% distortion or 1% distortion, and they almost never give you a continuous rating. And I see this a lot in the cheaper pro amps. If you look at some of the pro amplifiers that are online, like the $300 Behringers, for example, they almost never give you a full bandwidth rating with all channels driven. And I see people on the forums being like, I don't know why you guys spend $2,000 on that monoprice or Emotiva amplifier when you can get a $300 Behringer that has the same amount of power. And that's usually not the case, my friends. Power costs money. There's a lot of factors in those cheap pro amplifiers that affect sound quality and performance. They're generally meant for sound reinforcement. So you're looking at an amplifier. If an amplifier costs $300 and it weighs 10 pounds and it says it's 2,000 watts, there's a red flag there. That's not a continuous rating. That's probably an instantaneous rating. Who knows how they're giving you those power ratings? And if the amplifier only weighs 8 to 10 pounds and it has a lot of fans on it and it has an SMPS power supply instead of a linear power supply, there's definitely some compromises there. Now on the other end of the spectrum, I will tell you that price doesn't always guarantee better performance. I want to give you some examples. I want to tell you, over the years I've reviewed a good deal of amplifiers in my reference system, and I've got the $50,000 Status Acoustic AT speakers. So they're no slouch. These are serious speakers. They dip down to 2 ohms. They need a lot of current. They're very revealing, so they need good power. So in one particular case that I remember fondly is I had a very expensive audiophile amplifier from Past Labs. It was the X350.5. It was like $11,000. And this thing was a monster. Big amplifier, big heat sinks on the outside, very high bias into Class A. So the thing would literally cook an egg on it, just sitting there. You know, it was like a space heater. And the reason why they biased it really high into Class A is allegedly it gives you better sound, because Past Labs is all about the first watt. Well, the amplifier did sound great. It was a very smooth sounding amplifier. But when I went and I got an amplifier from a company called Class A, that was half the price, which was still very expensive at $6,500. It had about the same power ratings. It was a smaller, more compact amplifier. I was just blown away by its performance, both on the test bench and audio-wise. I felt like the Class A CT2300 just sounded smoother to me. It sounded more composed, especially at loud power levels when I was doing heavy bass transients on my AT reference speakers. And I was trying to figure out why, because this Past Labs amp was more expensive, it was bigger, yet the Class A amplifier sounded better to me. And they're both linear AB amplifiers, so it wasn't a difference in amplifier topology. Well, when I got them both on the bench, that's when I started understanding what was going on. The Past Labs amplifier, although it had a high bias in the Class A, they didn't use a whole lot of feedback in the design, and that was designed by intent because their philosophy is they use less feedback. Supposedly it provides better audiophile performance, and you know, they have a whole sort of theories. There's always been a bad reputation about using too much feedback, and we could talk about that in a separate video. But what I noticed when we got to the test extremes or the power ratings of both amplifiers, the Class A amplifier had a much lower distortion profile when I did an FFT analysis. And you could see that it was an amplifier that maintained its linearity whether it was driving at 1 watt or higher power. Whereas the Past Labs amp just had much higher distortion towards its rated power levels. Also, the Past Lab amplifier, even though it was in this big fancy chassis, had a smaller power supply. And I noticed this when I was running LFE content through the amplifier to my speakers on a Blu-ray disc, a high dynamic Blu-ray disc from Jeanette. The Past Labs amp was running out of gas, driving my speakers that were 2 ohms dips at base frequencies, whereas the Class A amplifier just had more oomph. It had a bigger power supply, it had a stiffer rails because of the power supply capacitance. So in that case, the half-price Class A amplifier, though not as prestigious as a brand or didn't look as good audiophile-wise, measured better and sounded better to my ears. Both amplifiers are still excellent amplifiers, but to compare 2 extremes here, the less expensive of the 2 sounded better to my ears. Now let's fast forward to Class D amplification. That's where you can get more differences that are audible in sound quality, because there are good Class D amplifier designs and there are not so good Class D amplifier designs. And what really governs that, in my opinion, is a really good Class D design amplifier will behave like an AB amplifier but be more efficient. When I say behave like it, I mean that it should be load invariant. And what I mean by load invariant is the frequency response of an amplifier should not change based on the impedance it's driving. So years ago I reviewed a Axiom audio amplifier. They had a Class D topology, and at the time it was, these amplifiers were getting new to the market, and it provided a lot of power in a very small chassis. It ran cool, but the problem with that amplifier and why I didn't like the sound of it compared to the best AB at the time was its frequency response changed with load impedance. So that amplifier in particular was really designed for a 4 ohm load. As you could see in the graphs that I measured it at, the frequency response would peak as the load impedance went up, and it would dip as the load impedance went down. So it's that kind of behavior that could affect sound quality. There was another amplifier I reviewed years later from a company called IQ Audio, which was another Class D amplifier in a pint-sized chassis. I mean, the thing was literally the size of like a router. I mean, I was really impressed with the fact that this thing would put out 150 watts into 8 ohms, 300 watts into 4 ohms. And it sounded great, and it was load invariant. So no matter what load it drove, the frequency response remained constant, and that was one of the first Class D amplifiers that I saw exhibit that behavior. So I put that amplifier up against my reference amps at the time, the Emotiva XPR1s, which were, to my feeling, some of the best sounding amplifiers I've ever reviewed. It's sad that the company has gone a different direction now and doesn't produce an amplifier like that. So what I found was the IQ audio amplifier sounded very similar to the XPR1 from Emotiva up until a point where I started driving it louder. Then I noticed that the IQ audio amplifier just sounded a little compressed. Didn't sound bad, didn't sound distorted, but what was happening when I took a closer look, it was that IQ audio amplifier was using what's called an SMPS power supply, and it didn't have a lot of headroom above its rated power, as opposed to the Emotiva amplifier that had a big toroid, big capacitor bank for a lot of stored energy, and it just had, it just had more headroom. So that's another factor is how good of a power supply you have, how much headroom is available beyond just its rated power. All of these things can affect sound, and it also depends on what kind of loudspeaker you're driving, your room acoustics, your source material. I mean, let's face it, if you're going to be listening to, and I love bands like U2, Genesis, Coldplay, if you're going to be listening to that kind of music primarily as your source material, that music is not very dynamically capable music. So you're not going to hear as much differences as you would with source material that is very dynamic. For example, like a Diana Krall record, or even Sting or something like that. So there's a lot of factors that do affect sound quality. I'm going to tell you right now that not all amplifiers do not sound the same. I know you're going to get comments down below where people are going to say, oh yes, they all sound the same as long as they're behaving within their linear region. Well, define to me their linear region, because most tests are done with just a dummy 8 ohm or 4 ohm load. And a speaker is a complex impedance. So it's harder to drive a speaker than just a resistive load. And you also have to think about transients as well. So there's a lot going on in amplifier design. I don't want to tell you that you have to go and spend tens of thousands of dollars on amplifiers these days, because the law of diminishing returns has really been narrowed over the last 5 or 10 years. There are great companies out there now offering very inexpensive, high quality solutions. Companies like Outlaw Audio, for example, or even Monoprice. Those amplifiers are really well designed amplifiers. They sound great. But you also have to watch the really low end of the spectrum when you're dealing with these couple of $100 commercial grade or sound reinforcement amplifiers. They're not going to give you the kind of fidelity, the signal to noise ratio that you're going to get out of these really well engineered amplifiers that are designed to have stiff power supply regulation and quiet operation. You don't want an amplifier that has a ton of fans in it that are always running to keep the thing cool, because there's not enough heatsink area in the chassis, because heat sinks cost money. So you got to look at the quality of the components. It really does matter. I hope this kind of answers your question about whether or not money buys you better performance. And I would say again, yes, it does up it to a certain point. But if you get into the really esoteric stuff, you're starting to reach the laws of diminishing returns, and you're paying for cosmetics and brand appeal. So give me your feedback down below. What are your favorite kind of amplifiers? Are you ready for the future? Because the future is Class D, my friends. And a few years ago, I wouldn't have made this declaration, but it's getting so good now. There's brands like Hypex, for example, Pascal, and the latest generation of ICE amplifiers that Legacy Audio uses. This is some really good designs, my friends. Now you're getting Class D, you're getting Class AB performance in terms of load invariant response, but you're getting the efficiency of Class D, which allows you to have higher channel density, so you can put more channels in one box, stick it in your rack, and not generate a lot of heat, and be able to use as much power from the wall as you can without wasting. Because Class D is giving you 90% plus efficiency, as opposed to the best Class AB at best that gives you 60 to 70% efficiency under full load. So give me your comments down below. What are your favorite kind of amplifiers? How much did you spend on your amplifier? Don't forget to join our Patreon at patreon.com/audioholics. You get access to our content earlier there. You get some other benefits you can look at our website and learn about. And until next time, my friends, keep listening.